Let's talk about what it means to win a war without fighting it. Not avoiding the fight because you're afraid. Not negotiating your way out because you don't have the strength. Winning, completely, decisively, humiliatingly, by making your enemy chase you across 300 miles of the Deccan Plateau until his army is starving, exhausted, and so completely outmaneuvered that the only options left are surrender or annihilation. That is what happened at Pacht. February 28, 1728. One of the most powerful rulers in India, a man with a larger army, more resources, decades of military experience and the full weight of Mughal imperial legitimacy behind him, signed a treaty on Bajirao's terms. Not because he had been defeated in battle. Because he had been made to look completely, comprehensively foolish by a 28-year-old who had moved his cavalry across the Deccan Plateau with a speed and precision that the Nizam's commanders, even afterward, struggled to fully explain. The Nizam of Hyderabad had expected a fight. What he got was a masterclass. This is the story of Pacht, the battle that wasn't really a battle, the campaign that rewrote the rules of warfare in 18th century India, and the moment when every ruler on the subcontinent stopped thinking of Bajirao Peshwa as a regional problem and started thinking of him as something considerably more alarming. He didn't win by fighting harder. He won by thinking faster. The Battle of Pacht is one of the most brilliant military operations in Indian history and almost nobody outside India has heard of it. That ends today. Subscribe, like the video, and let's break down exactly what Bajirao did and why military historians are still talking about it 300 years later. Before we get to Pacht, we need to understand who the Nizam was. Because context matters here. The scale of what Bajirao achieved at Pacht is only fully comprehensible when you understand exactly what he was up against. Nizam-ul-Mulk Asaf Ja'i, to give him his full title, which he would have insisted upon, was not some minor regional chieftain who happened to get in Bajirao's way. He was one of the most capable administrators and military commanders of his generation. He had served the Mughal Empire at the highest levels for decades, accumulating the kind of experience and political intelligence that only comes from years of navigating the most dangerous court in Asia. When the Mughal center began to fracture in the 1720s, he had moved with extraordinary speed and skill to carve out the Deccan as his own domain, establishing the Hyderabad state that would endure in various forms until 1948. He was, in short, serious. He was also significantly more powerful than Bajirao in conventional terms. His army was larger. His treasury was deeper. His territory was more established. His political connections, to the remaining Mughal imperial structure, to the various other regional powers of the Deccan, gave him a network of potential support that Bajirao could not match. And he had something else that mattered enormously in the politics of the era: legitimacy. The Nizam had Mughal imperial sanction for his position. He was formally the Mughal viceroy of the Deccan. Whatever the practical reality of Mughal power by the late 1720s, the symbolism still carried weight with the various smaller rulers and chieftains whose allegiances were up for grabs. The relationship between the Nizam and the Maratha Confederacy had been tense since the beginning of Bajirao's tenure. The Nizam had, on several occasions, actively worked to destabilize Bajirao's position, cultivating relationships with Maratha chieftains who resented the Peshwa's dominance, providing support to factions within the Confederacy that opposed Bajirao's expansion agenda, and generally doing everything a skilled political operator could do to limit Maratha power without forcing an open confrontation. He had been doing this because he understood, with the clarity of genuine intelligence, that an unchecked Maratha expansion under Bajirao's leadership was an existential threat to the Hyderabad state. Bajirao's vision of Maratha dominance across the subcontinent left no comfortable space for an independent Nizam. One of them was going to have to be subordinate to the other. The Nizam intended to ensure that it wasn't him. By 1727, the tension had escalated beyond what diplomatic maneuvering could contain. The Nizam had made a series of moves that Bajirao interpreted, correctly, as direct challenges to Maratha authority in the Deccan. He had intercepted Maratha revenue collection in territory that Bajirao considered under Maratha control. He had provided shelter and support to Trimbakrao Dabada, a Maratha commander whose relationship with Bajirao was increasingly adversarial. He had, in effect, been picking at the edges of Maratha power with enough consistency that Bajirao had to respond. The question was how. Bajirao's strategic situation in late 1727 was genuinely complicated, and it's worth spending a moment with the complexity because the brilliance of what he did next only makes sense against that background. He was not, at this point, in a position to simply overwhelm the Nizam with superior force. The Maratha army was formidable, but it was not twice the size of the Nizam's force. A conventional campaign, march toward each other, find a good field, fight it out, was not obviously going to produce the result Bajirao needed. The Nizam was too good a commander, and his defensive position in the Deccan was too strong for a straightforward military contest to be reliably decisive. There was also the political dimension. A campaign against the Nizam that produced a messy, inconclusive result would damage Bajirao's standing in exactly the ways he could least afford. He had spent 7 years building a reputation for decisive, clean victories. A prolonged war of attrition against the Nizam, even one that eventually went in his favor, would drain resources, give his internal opponents ammunition, and potentially encourage other powers to probe Maratha vulnerabilities while the army was engaged. He needed something different. He needed a result that was fast, decisive, and so complete that it closed the question permanently. He also needed to be dealing with the Nizam and simultaneously managing a situation in Malwa, in northern India, where Maratha expansion was being contested by Mughal-backed forces under the governor Muhammad Khan Bangash. The two situations were connected. The Nizam and the Mughal north were potential allies against the Marathas, and Bajirao's challenge was to prevent them from coordinating while dealing with both. This is the context in which he conceived what would become the Pakht campaign. The plan, as it evolved through the late months of 1727, was breathtaking in its audacity and, in retrospect, almost obvious in its logic. Almost. In the way that genuinely great solutions to difficult problems always look obvious in retrospect, before you remember that nobody else thought of them. The plan was not to fight the Nizam where the Nizam was strong. It was to make the Nizam move, then control where he moved and then use that movement against him. December 1727. Bajirao moved his cavalry out of Maratha territory and into the Deccan with a speed that immediately created problems for the Nizam's intelligence network. The Nizam's commanders were accustomed to tracking Maratha movements through the network of informants and scouts that any competent military force maintained. They could do this effectively when the Marathas were moving at conventional speeds along predictable routes. Bajirao was not moving at conventional speeds along predictable routes. The Maratha cavalry in this campaign traveled light in a way that was unprecedented even by their own previous standards. No supply wagons. None. The troopers carried what they could on their horses and lived off the land, supplemented by prepositioned supplies that Bajirao had arranged weeks in advance through a logistics system that was, for the period, extraordinarily sophisticated. A system of rapid communication meant that Bajirao had better real-time intelligence about the Nizam's movements than the Nizam had about his. The opening move was a feint. Bajirao sent a substantial Maratha force toward Aurangabad, the Nizam's capital. Not to take it. Not even really to threaten it. To make the Nizam think he was threatening it, which was entirely different and considerably more useful. The Nizam responded exactly as Bajirao had anticipated. He moved his main army toward Aurangabad to defend it, which was the rational military response to an apparent threat to your capital. It was also exactly the movement that Bajirao needed him to make, because it pulled the Nizam's force away from the strong defensive positions it had been occupying in the southern Deccan and into the open terrain of the central plateau, where the Maratha cavalry's advantages in speed and mobility were maximized. The Nizam at this point probably felt like he was doing well. He had identified the Maratha threat and was moving to address it. His army was large, well-organized, and moving with the confidence of a force that believed it had the measure of its opponent. He did not yet understand what was happening. This is where the campaign becomes something genuinely extraordinary. While the Nizam was moving toward Aurangabad to respond to the apparent Maratha threat, Bajirao did something that his opponent took several days to even register, and then several more days to fully believe. He went around him. Not through him. Around him. Bajirao took the main Maratha force on a sweeping arc that bypassed the Nizam's army entirely, moved south and east at a pace that should not have been physically possible given the distances involved, and positioned himself between the Nizam and the Nizam's supply lines and base of operations. The maneuver took approximately 12 days. 12 days to move an army of cavalry across several hundred miles of the Deccan Plateau, maintain operational security throughout, and arrive in position before the Nizam had fully processed what was happening. When the Nizam's commanders finally understood the geometry of the situation, they faced a problem that had no clean solution. Their army was in the wrong place. They were cut off from their primary supply bases in the south. The routes back to their comfortable, well-provisioned positions in the Deccan were now controlled, or at least seriously threatened, by the Maratha force. Moving north meant moving deeper into territory where they had no supply network and where the Marathas could harass them indefinitely. Moving south meant fighting through Bajirao's cavalry to re-establish contact with their logistics, and doing that on Bajirao's chosen terms on terrain he had selected, against a force that had been deliberately resting and resupplying while the Nizam's army marched. And the Nizam's army was hungry. This is the part of POC that gets lost in the strategic analysis. The sheer physical misery of what the Nizam's force experienced over the weeks that followed. They had marched from their defensive positions into open terrain in response to a threat that turned out to be a feint. They had then watched, with mounting horror, as the real Maratha force materialized behind them rather than in front of them. And now they were in the Deccan Plateau in the middle of an Indian winter, with their supply lines cut and a cavalry force they couldn't pin down and destroying everything they tried to forage. Bajirao's cavalry was everywhere and nowhere. Every time the Nizam tried to push toward food and water, Maratha horsemen materialized, harassed the foraging parties, and disappeared before a major engagement could develop. Every time the Nizam tried to force a battle on his terms, to use his numerical advantage in a pitched engagement that might break the Maratha grip on the situation, Bajirao declined. He did not need to fight that battle. He was winning without it. There is something important here that goes beyond the military mechanics. Bajirao understood something about his opponent that the purely tactical analysis misses. The Nizam was not just facing a logistical problem. He was facing a psychological one. And Bajirao had engineered the situation with the psychological dimension fully in mind. The Nizam-ul-Mulk had spent decades building a reputation as one of the foremost military and political figures of his era. He had managed the Mughal court's internal politics at the highest levels. He had carved his own state out of the chaos of imperial decline. He had a self-image and a public reputation that was built on competence, experience, and strategic mastery. And now he was being made to look like a fool by a man 15 years his junior. Every day that passed without the Nizam being able to force a decisive engagement was another day that his prestige eroded, in his own eyes, in the eyes of his commanders, and in the eyes of every ruler in India who was watching the campaign with intense interest. Every foraging party that Maratha cavalry destroyed without consequence was another demonstration that the Nizam could not protect his own army in the field. Every failed attempt to pin down the Maratha force was another public demonstration of the gap between the Nizam's reputation and his actual ability to deal with the situation he was in. Bajirao understood this. The campaign was designed as much to humiliate as to defeat. Not out of cruelty, or not primarily, out of strategy. Because a Nizam who signed a treaty after being militarily outmaneuvered but not publicly humiliated was a Nizam who would feel justified in revisiting that treaty when circumstances changed. A Nizam whose defeat had been so complete, so visible, so widely observed by the entire political community of India, was a Nizam who was going to have a much harder time presenting himself as a continuing major threat to Maratha interests. The goal was not just to win this round. The goal was to make the Nizam reluctant to risk another round. By February 1728, the Nizam's situation had deteriorated from difficult to desperate. His army had been marching and counter-marching across the Deccan Plateau for weeks. The supply situation had gone from strained to critical. Men who had started the campaign well-equipped and confident were now conserving their last provisions and watching the horizon for Maratha cavalry that might appear from any direction at any time. The morale effect was significant. This needs to be understood clearly. The Nizam's army was not destroyed. It still existed as a fighting force. But an army that has been outmaneuvered for weeks, that is hungry, that has watched its foraging parties get destroyed every time they venture beyond the main camp, that cannot force an engagement with the enemy despite having a numerical advantage, that army's will to fight is a diminishing asset. Every day without a clear path to improvement was a day that made the eventual reckoning worse. Bajirao positioned his main force near the village of Pakht, in the Nagar district of what is now Maharashtra, and waited. The waiting was itself a message. He was not attacking. He did not need to attack. His position was strong, his supply situation was good, and time was working entirely in his favor. Every hour the Nizam remained in his current situation, the calculus of the available options got worse. The Nizam moved toward Pakht in early February, not because it was his preferred option but because the alternatives had run out. He needed to force a decisive engagement, and Bajirao had chosen to accept it on his terms, which meant on ground that favored the Maratha cavalry and at a moment when the Nizam's army was at its weakest. What happened at Pakht on February 28, 1728 was less a battle than a formal acknowledgement of the reality that the preceding weeks had created. The Nizam attempted to maneuver for position. Bajirao's cavalry responded with a precision and speed that made the Nizam's movements look slow by comparison. The terrain worked against the larger force. The Maratha units that engaged the Nizam's flanks did so with a ferocity that cut off the possibility of an orderly retreat. Within hours, It was clear that the Nizam faced a choice between a catastrophic defeat in the field and a negotiated settlement. He chose the settlement. The Treaty of Mungishigaon, signed on February 28, 1728, at a location just outside Pakht, was everything Bajirao had been working toward. The Nizam agreed to stop supporting Maratha rivals. He acknowledged Maratha rights to collect Chauth revenue in the territories that had been disputed. He effectively conceded that his attempt to limit Maratha expansion had failed and that Bajirao's vision of Maratha dominance in the Deccan was going to proceed whether he supported it or not. He signed the document. He did so in circumstances that left absolutely no ambiguity about what had happened. Bajirao had taken the most powerful ruler in the Deccan and made him beg. The news traveled fast. In the 18th century, before telegraph lines and newspapers, political news moved through networks of merchants, travelers, court correspondents, and the various intelligence operations that every significant power maintained. The story of Pakht was told and retold across India within weeks, in the courts of Delhi, in the merchant houses of Surat, in the halls of every regional ruler who had been watching the Maratha-Nizam confrontation with interest. And the story that traveled was not a complicated one. Bajirao Peshwa had taken the Nizam of Hyderabad, one of the most experienced and powerful rulers in India, into the field and destroyed him. Not with superior numbers. Not with technological advantage. With intelligence, speed, and a strategic concept so complete that the Nizam had never found an effective response to it. The implications were not lost on anyone. If Bajirao could do this to the Nizam, with this speed, with this completeness, with this apparent ease, what exactly was going to stop him from doing the same thing to anyone else? The answer, as various rulers across the subcontinent were beginning to understand, was not much. Within the Maratha Confederacy, Pakht transformed Bajirao's political position in ways that went beyond the merely military. The commanders who had served under him returned from the campaign with a loyalty that was qualitatively different from what they had brought to it. You can be loyal to a commander because of his position, because of his family, because of habit. You become loyal to a commander the way Bajirao's men were loyal after Pakht because you have personally witnessed something extraordinary and you understand that following this man is qualitatively different from following anyone else. The skeptics who had questioned his appointment in 1720 were, by 1728, not merely silenced. They were converted. Shripad Rao Natu, who had been most openly opposed, reportedly said after Pakht that he had been wrong not merely about Bajirao's readiness but about the category of man Bajirao was. He was not a capable Peshwa. He was something India had not seen in a long time. The word people started using, quietly at first and then with increasing openness, was not Peshwa. It was conqueror. Externally, Pakht reshaped the political geography of the Deccan more completely than any military campaign in the preceding decade. The Nizam did not disappear. He remained a significant power, and his relationship with the Marathas continued to be complicated for years afterward. But the terms of that relationship had been permanently altered. He was no longer an equal. He was a subordinate power that had been given an opportunity to acknowledge the new reality gracefully. He had taken that opportunity. And Bajirao had already turned his attention north. Because Pakht was not the destination. It was the foundation. Military historians, and I want to spend a moment on this because it matters, have analyzed Pakht for 300 years and consistently reached the same conclusion. What Bajirao achieved in the Pakht campaign was not merely a victory. It was the demonstration of a military concept that was genuinely ahead of its time. The idea of using mobility not to win battles but to make battles unnecessary, to position your force in such a way that the enemy's strategic situation deteriorates regardless of what happens on any individual engagement, is a concept that appears in European military thinking most clearly in the campaigns of Napoleon decades later. Bajirao was doing it in the Deccan in 1727 to 1728. The specific mechanics of the Pakht campaign, the feint toward Aurangabad, the sweeping maneuver around the Nizam's flank, the deliberate interdiction of supply lines rather than pursuit of pitched battle, read in modern military analysis as almost textbook examples of what would later be called maneuver warfare. The goal is not to destroy the enemy's army directly. The goal is to destroy the enemy's ability to function as a coherent force, to cut their supply lines, isolate their units, degrade their morale and their will to continue, until the army ceases to be an effective instrument regardless of whether it has been physically destroyed. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the British commander who was one of the more thoughtful military historians of the 20th century, whatever one thinks of his battlefield performance, reportedly studied the Pakht campaign and described it as a masterpiece of strategic planning. Whether this specific attribution is accurate is less important than the judgment it expresses. The campaign has been included in military studies curricula because it illustrates principles that remain relevant regardless of the era. 300 years later, Bajirao did this at 28. February 28, 1728. The Nizam signed. And somewhere in the Maratha camp, a 28-year-old Peshwa was already thinking about what came next. Not because Pakht hadn't satisfied him. Because satisfaction was not really a category that Bajirao Peshwa operated in. There was always a next objective, a next opportunity, a next use of the position he had just secured. The Nizam had been the obstacle to expansion north. The Nizam was now, if not exactly an ally, at least a neutralized threat. The path north was open. Delhi was there. And Bajirao was going. In the next episode, we follow the campaign north, the marches into Malwa, the confrontations with Mughal-backed forces, and the moment that announced to every ruler in India that the Maratha Confederacy under Bajirao Peshwa was not a regional power with continental ambitions. It was a continental power. Full stop. If Pakht hit you the way it hit me when I first read about it, that feeling of watching someone do something so cleanly elegant that it makes you question everything you thought you knew about what's possible. Share this with someone. This story deserves more people knowing it. And tell me in the comments, what was the most surprising thing about Pakht? Because I think I know what it is, but I want to hear it from you.